This video features and discusses the topic of mental illness, in particular, obsessive-compulsive disorder. Please consider before watching the video. The first John Green novel I read was Looking for Alaska when I was 17, and I thought it was pretty good and had a fabulous time reading it. Then I read Paper Towns and thought it was shite. Stop me if you've heard this before, but back then my main complaint was that he just wrote the same story twice. Okay, fair enough, but since then I've heard that exact complaint echoed by many other people, which over the years has become somewhat a point of fascination for me in particular. You see, if you actually look for positive things in any given Green novel, you'll find quite a bit to like. John Green is fantastic at constructing meaning around rich themes and writing characters as narrators, and this was at the forefront when I read his fiction for the first time. It grabbed me as the thing that clearly sells him as a skilled author. However, for whatever reason, I, and other heartless bastards, read a second novel of his and found that the narrative meaning and characterization just sailed right past us because we were too distracted by the superficial similarities of the surface-level details. And if you're mainly paying attention to the actual storytelling of Green's work, then yeah, there are a lot of things to complain about. Something that I noticed over the years is that for people like me, the people who fell out of enjoying John Green's novels, it doesn't really matter which books we read or what order we read them in. We all enjoyed our first Green novel, but hated our second. This is anecdotal evidence, so take it with a grain of salt, but I've known friends and acquaintances who have loved Paper Towns but hated Looking for Alaska, loved An Abundance of Catherines but hated The Fault in Our Stars, and loved The Fault in Our Stars but hated An Abundance of Catherines. Now, none of those friends ever went on to read a third Green novel, but I did. My third Green novel was The Fault in Our Stars, which I really tried to put in the effort to enjoy properly, but just found that I couldn't. I could see why other people enjoyed it, but it never really connected with me in that way. So as I handed what was to be my copy of Turtles All the Way Down to the Cashier, I realized that I was making a mistake as a conscious consumer. I'm not a young adult anymore, and I haven't properly enjoyed a Green novel in ages, so I have no business buying this thing, really. But hey, I'm a YouTuber who speaks to his audience through a talking brown bird in a shirt, so I'm clearly not above knowingly making bad decisions. But basically, I was wondering to myself, and you might be reasonably wondering this too, why do I even care to read and talk about this novel? If I expected going into it that I wasn't going to like it because it's not to my tastes and I'm not even in the target audience for it anymore, couldn't I have just read something else instead? Well, I have several reasons for picking on John Green today. First, he's popular and I like the attention. Second, teenagers aren't the only people singing John Green's praises. There are a ton of well-read adults out there who also enjoy and make reference to Green novels, and pissing off high-minded YouTubers has been on my bucket list for a while. And third, I need to reconcile something. I used to be subscribed to the Vlogbrothers, I watched Crash Course, and I genuinely loved reading Looking for Alaska. Many years back, I was what you might call a fan of the Green Brothers, but over time I slowly drifted away from the media content that they were providing. Part of that was just to do with my tastes changing over time. I might no longer enjoy the style of presentation in something like Crash Course, but I can still appreciate that show a lot for being genuinely good, well-made educational material. Similarly, I didn't get bored of the Vlogbrothers as much as I just got bored of vlogging in general. Like, I just find that vlogging as a format can't keep me entertained, but even then, I still consider the Vlogbrothers to be one of the best vlogging channels that I know of. I can say with confidence that if I still enjoyed bite-sized educational videos or vlogs, that I'd probably still enjoy Crash Course and the Vlogbrothers. others. The same hasn't been true for me for John Green's novels, though. When I began thinking back on them, I found myself doubting whether or not Looking for Alaska was actually that good in the first place, or whether I just had bad, underdeveloped tastes when I first read it. By the time I finished The Fault in Our Stars, I had lots of conflicting feelings about Green's novels, both positive and negative, but at the time I found it difficult to articulate whether or not I thought he was actually a good or bad writer. Eventually, I was introduced to the discourse surrounding John Green as a media personality, and while some of that is absolute rubbish and I'm not going to talk about it, I found the critical reception of Green as an author to be very lacking. Typically, you'll find people in two camps. Green's fans will sing his praises and maybe mention one or two minor criticisms, but all in all, they are overwhelmingly positive. That's fair, I have no qualms with that. You like what you like, don't let me stop you. Meanwhile, Green's detractors usually drum up the criticisms of his novels are poorly written, he romanticizes serious issues, or the infamous he just writes the same story over and over again. And hey, if you don't like Green's books, that's also fine. I'm not here to convince you that you have to enjoy them. Basically, I just never found that my experience with Green's novels was well represented by either chorus. I can't say that I think that the unabashed praise that they receive from reviewers is accurately reflective of their actual quality, but I'm also not willing to dismiss Green as an author because the man definitely has skill. I think he's got a talent for decent characterization, of his narrators especially, and he's got a solid grasp on theming and symbolism, but I don't think he's anything particularly special. His novels always kinda just feel a little bit samey, and I've never liked his writing style. But I can see why someone would enjoy his novels, and they can excel in moments, provided that those moments resonate with you, but they don't really make his novels worth reading on their own. So if I'm kinda just lukewarm on John Green, why is the title of this video book burning? Well, because it's clickbait. Hey, we all gotta make a living somehow, fam. Okay, but seriously, now that I've got you here, I do actually have some substantive things to say about Totals All the Way Down and John Green's writing that I hope you'll find constructive and entertaining. So please do stick around because we're hopefully going to have some fun. Also, it's highly recommended that you read this novel before watching the video. I spoil like the whole thing, no holds barred. I go from beginning to end. I will say that John Green's use of themes has always generally been quite good, and he seems to have gotten much better at writing stories that are well supported by very strong themes in his more recent novels. One of the reasons why I think fans really reacted overwhelmingly positively to The Fault in Our Stars is because that novel's themes were incredibly focused. Most major elements of the story tied back in some way to the topic of terminal illness and its accompanying existential problems. It means the novel's core ideas are much easier to follow and makes the conflicts and arcs involving the characters resonate more strongly within this particular narrative. As much as I like Looking for Alaska, I'd say that it has much weaker support for its themes than The Fault in Our Stars because many of the details and elements of the novel are incidental. The most obvious improvement that was made between the two novels is in each's main character. In Looking for Alaska, Miles Pudge Halter is his own round, fully fleshed out character, and he's perfectly serviceable for the story's narrative and thematic interests, but he is, for all intents and purposes, just a very unremarkable middle-class teenage boy. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. The story doesn't suffer in any way with Miles as the protagonist, but it's also not an exceptionally strong or compelling character design for supporting the themes. In contrast, Hazel Grace Lancaster much more strongly supports the core themes of The Fault in Our Stars because, well, she has cancer. Her cancer is an integral part of her character, drives the plot forward, and is used as a device to support and explore themes. Hazel embodies pun intended, the core themes of her story, which strengthens not only the story, but also her character. Building characters and plot elements with the core themes of the text in mind goes a long way to improving the overall quality and cohesiveness of the story. This improvement has been carried forward to Turtles All the Way Down, which is even strong in that all the core themes are broad and distinct, but also interlink with and comment on each other. The two biggest themes of Turtles All the Way Down appear to be mental illness and self-authorship, and honestly, the best part of this novel is that one of these themes is used to talk about the other and vice versa. You could write an entire story that revolves around just one of these themes, but Green tackles both in a way that makes them relevant topics of discussion to each other, and that's the mark of a fantastic storyteller.
At the first time I realised I might be fictional, my weekdays were spent at a publicly funded institution on the north side of Indianapolis called White River High School, where I was required to eat lunch at a particular time, between 12:37 p.m. and 1:14 p.m., by forces so much larger than myself that I couldn't even begin to identify them. If these forces had given me a different lunch period, or if the table mates who helped author my fate had chosen a different topic of conversation that September day, I would have met a different end, or at least a different middle. But I was beginning to learn that your life is a story told about you, not one that you tell.
The protagonist and narrator of Turtles All the Way Down is Asa Holmes, and I'll give you 0 seconds to have already realized that's a reference to Sherlock Holmes because this isn't exactly a subtle form of intertextuality. Asa has obsessive-compulsive disorder, and several drafts ago I had written out a clinical explanation of what obsessive-compulsive disorder was, using sources like Beyond Blue before realizing that I was contradicting the third major theme of the novel, the limitations of language in human expression, but we'll get there eventually. If you want a more detailed explanation of OCD, you can get a medical rundown from the links I've put in the description, but all you need to know for a baseline understanding is that the disorder has two parts to it. First, the OCD sufferer has uncontrollable, obsessive thoughts about things, and second, those thoughts compel them to behave in certain ways that they can find extremely difficult to resist. Sufferers aren't necessarily obsessive about everything, and they aren't obsessive all the time. Like with all disorders, the severity differs from person to person, the symptoms can manifest in many different ways, and treatment can have different levels of effectiveness depending on the particular patient and their life circumstances. Returning to Turtles All the Way Down, Asa's primary obsession is with hygiene. She's almost constantly worried about infections and has a particular fixation upon the microorganism Clostridium difficile, which is shortened to just C. diff for this story. Her compulsive behavior manifests itself in a lot of ways. She repeatedly replaces a bandage over a self-inflicted wound on her finger, and she's very frequently reading about various diseases on her phone under the anxiety that she may have them. Several times during the plot, Asa stops what she's doing to go into the nearest available bathroom to wash her hands, and sometimes her mouth, because her thoughts fixate themselves on her risk of catching an infection. Now, the behavioral compulsions are the outwardly visible part of the disorder, but Turtles All the Way Down has a far greater interest in illustrating and exploring the inner psychological side and the experience of the sufferer. The more terrifying and confronting part of the disorder is that thoughts will frequently and aggressively manifest themselves inside Asa's conscious mind without her want or agency. She doesn't have a practical, intellectual, or emotional interest in constantly thinking about hygiene and infections, but the disorder forces her to think about them obsessively to the degree that it seems to Asa like she doesn't have control over her own thoughts. This ties into the self-authorship theme. Experiencing this provokes Asa to think about how much control she actually has over herself. Is she her own person with her own thoughts, or are her thoughts, and therefore her actions and her very personality, determined by factors outside of her control? Does she, in fact, have a definitive thing inside her somewhere that she can call her self? Her OCD is used as evidence to say, no, Asa isn't in total control of herself, her thoughts and behavior, and therefore her life, is out of her hands and she's just along for the ride. Now, that's not what the novel actually argues, but it's an angle that it wants the reader to be aware of, and it's an example of how the mental illness theme and the self-authorship theme can be combined to generate a very potent idea that has the potential to inform and enrich the story being told. There's a really great scene in this book where Asa is making out with the love interest for this story, Davis Pickett, as teenagers in these types of stories do, but she quickly starts obsessing that physical intimacy means that she's picking up a lot of his microbiota, and she can't stop thinking about how just by kissing him she's probably ingested a lot of the bacteria he's carrying. So she ends up having to stop, goes inside to wash her hands and mouth out, and after that she can't bring herself to be that intimate with him again. I'll admit that the scene is a tad cliche. Usually in these types of teen romance stories there's a point where the two love interests want to be intimate, but then something stops them, and that's supposed to create drama that can be resolved later when they do end up together. John Green's take on this trope is still quite acceptable though, because it doubles as a way of showing the reader that Aza's disorder controls her thoughts and behavior in a way that goes against what she actually wants. It's a genuinely fantastic scene.
It's fine, you're fine, just kiss him. You need to check something. It's fine, just be fucking normal. Check to see if his microbes stay in you. Billions of people kiss and don't die. Just make sure his microbes aren't going to permanently colonize you. Come on, please stop this. He could have Campylobacter. He could be a non-symptomatic E. coli carrier. Get that, and you'll need antibiotics, and then you'll get C. diff, and boom, dead in 4 days. Please fucking stop this. Just kiss him. Just check to make sure. I pulled away. You okay? He asked. I nodded. I just need a little air. I sat up, turned away from him, pulled out my phone and searched. Do bacteria of people you kiss stay inside your body?
The mental illness and self-authorship themes also end up being the basis on which the third major theme is discussed, the limitations of language. The idea is that the experience of losing her agency, as illustrated through the previous themes, is something that Aza struggles to articulate both to others and to herself because she lacks the language to express those experiences. This leads not only to a greater sense of isolation from others who can't understand her experience, but also a frustration that she might not even fully understand this problem that has affected her so much. I really enjoyed the idea that Aza can use her own terminology to express her personal experiences. The example terms are invasive thoughts and thought spirals, which are fine enough, but the message to the audience is that they should find it in themselves to articulate their experiences in their own ways, including ways outside of just spoken language with things like the Raymond Pettibon painting that represents Aza's thought spirals visually. I think that's an empowering and useful takeaway for the audience.
I found myself pulled towards the painting that Michael had called Pettibon. It was a colourful spiral, or maybe a multicoloured rose, or a whirlpool. By some trick of the curved lines, my eyes got lost in the painting, so that I kept having to refocus on tiny individual pieces of it. It didn't feel like something I was looking at, so much as something I was a part of.
You see, here's why John Green is worth reading and talking about. The way he constructs his story elements, the characters, beats, symbolism, and so on, to draw from and also emphasize his core themes is actually pretty masterful. And if you're an aspiring writer, you can find a lot of great examples for how to design characters or plot details around your core themes to the benefit of your reader's experience by studying Green's work. The themes of Turtles All the Way Down are actually the strongest elements of this story, which is why the first part of this book burning is actually weirdly positive. Well, now that I've said that, I actually do have a broad criticism of the themes in Turtles All the Way Down, but it doesn't have anything to do with the themes themselves or how they're structured or the symbols through which they're integrated into the story. It's a bugbear of mine that's endemic to Green's writing overall, and you're going to become very familiar with it over the course of this video. When John Green wants the reader to learn or internalize something, he appears not to trust that the reader will be able to infer or interpret that from the story material alone. So even though he has all of these story elements pointed towards the core themes in really interesting ways, he ends up just explicitly and unambiguously raising certain ideas through direct explanation and argumentation. This is usually done in the form of random musings on the part of the narrator or the characters. Here's an example of how something is mused upon in the narration. This is in the middle of a dialogue scene between Aza and Davis. The pair are in a conversation about how they can't currently see the nighttime stars due to the overcast. In the previous scene, Davis asked Aza if she'd ever been in love before, and Aza has been ruminating over the language of this question well into this scene. Mid-conversation, during an awkward pause, the reader is given this passage to read through.
I thought about him asking me if I'd ever been in love. It's a weird phrase in English. In love, like it's a sea you drown in or a town you live in. You don't get to be in anything else, in friendship or in anger or in hope. All you can be in is love, and I wanted to tell him that even though I'd never been in love, I knew what it was like to be in a feeling, to be not just surrounded by it, but also permeated by it, the way my grandmother talked about God being everywhere. When my thoughts spiraled, I was in the spiral. And of it, and I wanted to tell him that the idea of being in a feeling gave language to something I couldn't describe before, created a form for it, but I couldn't figure out how to say any of that out loud.
If I'm being generous, I would say that by the time that the narrator mentions that she knew what it was like to be in a feeling, to be not just surrounded by it but also permeated by it, I got the idea. It was clear as day by that point, and the paragraph could have ended there, but even in that scenario, it still wouldn't be acceptable because it interrupts the scene to wax philosophical directly to the reader. The better way of incorporating themes into the fabric of a literary story would be to incorporate it through use of language. There are probably many ways of doing this, but here's a simple example. Instead of explaining this concept in a paragraph, how about you just raise the initial idea, I thought about that phrase, in love, and considered what it meant to be in a feeling, and then perhaps use that turn of phrase, in earnest, later on with other emotions. Oh, and I know that earnest isn't an emotion, come on, it was good, let me have this! Aza could subtly mention in a later scene that she feels in sadness, or was left in melancholy. I never found an instance of this happening in the novel, although I'm willing to concede that there might be some that I missed, but I reckon that this use of language could actually get the reader thinking about this idea themselves from the way the novel is written. That way, the story isn't interrupted by the musing and the themes are better integrated into the literature. And yeah, it's probably not the best way of achieving this, but it's still preferable to a direct explanation in my books. John Green's theming and symbolism are extremely good at a structural level, but tend to falter on their execution within the story. So the structural level is what I was singing the virtues of earlier, the underlying ideas and themes that the novel conveys to the reader through symbols and story elements and the way the story is put together. Whenever you see someone praise Green's writing, the themes and ideas are usually what they'll start talking about. They might even read a passage from the text to illustrate their point, but very rarely will they actually dig into how the novel raises and discusses these ideas through the actual writing. This is because the way that Green writes his themes and ideas into his novels is actually quite bad. I don't mean that he fumbles his ideas. No, the ideas themselves are always very clear and robust, but the ideas end up being an interruption to the story rather than naturally growing out of it. We can declare this is what the novel is talking about, has on its mind, is ultimately saying, because Green's theming and ideas are so clear, which is good, but in only talking about the fact that Green's novels simply have these ideas, we're missing the discussion of how they're presented and whether that constitutes good writing or storytelling. In literary studies, something we talk about a lot is the literature's form. How does literature uniquely convey ideas, emotions, or other types of meaning through the use of the written word? When academics dissect and discuss what they would call great literature, they're not just talking about texts that have good ideas. Very few people who study literature above a high school level are terribly interested in discussing ideas divorced from the actual text that raises them. Seriously, if you've ever been in a university literature class and someone starts arguing with the text over its ideas, you can just feel the energy get drained out of the room. Unless you're talking about the historical significance of a fiction, people who study literature are far more interested in how the use of language, literary elements, and storytelling creates meaning, rather than exactly what that meaning is. This is why you see authors like James Joyce, Catherine Mansfield, Gertrude Stein, and the other usual suspects studied in literature courses over more widely enjoyed or critically acclaimed authors. Joyce and Mansfield aren't necessarily superior as storytellers, and believe me, nobody actually expects you to enjoy reading them, but their literary techniques in both writing and narrative are unquestionably more sophisticated and generate more meaning than the vast majority of contemporary authors active today. I'm not saying that John Green should employ the same level of sophistication in his writing as Joyce or Mansfield, by the by. I'm just trying to illustrate the importance of using the strengths of the medium in your product. Green wrote Turtles All the Way Down in the format of a novel, so how does being a novel inform the way that the story is told or how meaning is generated? The meaning ought to be generated by the literary form of the novel, not by the author having the narrator or the characters unambiguously muse upon things. Form is important because it changes a lot about how audiences will respond to a piece of media. People complain about long cutscenes in video games, but no one complains that movies have long, unbroken periods of non-interactivity. Okay, that's a kitsch example, but you get the idea, right? Let's talk about the Tuatara.
The whole point of the Tuatara is that it is a cold
Hello,
Jedi...
Lisa! I'm the Tuatara!
So the Tuatara actually ties nicely into the theme of self-authorship. One of the things that Aza brings up to Dr. Singh is that she's wondering whether or not there's a definitive unchanging self beneath all the chaotic amorphous anxieties and obsessions that make up her personality. To mirror that idea, the Tuatara at some point is talked about by the zoologist character Malik like this.
Did you know that Tuatara can carry parasites? Tua carries salmonella, for instance, but they never get sick from them? But what fascinates me most, and this is the focus of my research, is their molecular evolution rate. As far as we can tell, Tuatara haven't changed much in the last 200 million years, okay? They look the same as their fossils, and Tuatara do everything slowly. They mature slowly, they don't stop growing until they're 30, they reproduce slowly. They lay eggs only once every 4 years. They have a very slow metabolism. But despite doing everything slowly and having not changed much in 200 million years, Tuatara have a faster rate of molecular mutation than any other known animal. Like, they're evolving faster? At a molecular level, yes. They change more rapidly than humans or lions or fruit flies.
The symbolism here has two direct ties that I can find on a cursory reading. The first is the bit about Tuataras not being affected by parasites. This is relevant to a comment that Aza makes earlier in the text about how she likens her mental disorder to a parasite that's controlling her life. It's possible to read this as an ideal for Aza. She ought to contain her so-called parasites but not let herself be affected by them. You could also feasibly read this as symbolic for the negligence and ignorance of outside observers. Malik says that the Tuatara is unaffected by the parasites, but it's possible that he simply doesn't see the effects that the parasites have on the Tuatara, because he himself isn't a Tuatara, and makes the same assumption that outside observers to mental disorders make, that because they can't see the effects, that there are no real effects. You can interpret it either way, and as far as I know, the text itself doesn't push you towards one or the other. The second bit of symbolism is the molecular evolution rate. Malik explains that Tuataras barely change physically despite having the highest molecular evolution rate known in animals. Everything at the core of their being, in their DNA, is shifting and changing constantly, but on the outside they appear and behave the same. In other words, there's way more change and chaos happening in the internal realms of Tuataras than a cursory look at the animal would suggest. Again, this can be interpreted as a symbolic parallel to Aza, with her mental disorder being symbolized by the rapidly changing DNA. Her internal self is undergoing a lot of chaos and change, which isn't reflected by a cursory look at her outward appearance or behavior. The other way that you can interpret this is that the Tuatara remains what you would call a Tuatara despite all the changes going on inside it. The Tuatara has something that roots it as definitively being a Tuatara. This is similarly a way of interpreting the Tuatara as being a symbolic ideal for Aza, as she wants there to be a definitive unchanging thing inside her that she can call her self. Again, the novel doesn't push for either interpretation as far as I know, so you can go with either depending on what resonates with you. Now, this is actually a pretty good thematic tie between Aza's existential plight and a prominent symbol of the text. The other contribution that the Tuatara makes to the story is that it's also the inheritor to the Pickett fortune as a cruel joke by Russell Pickett against his two sons. Russell is said to believe that the Tuatara holds the secret to human immortality. Immortality can be read as a symbolic stand-in for legacy perhaps, or even a pie-in-the-sky unattainable goal. You can interpret this gesture of one symbol to another in many different ways. In fact, I'd go so far as to say this particular element of the fiction is very open to interpretation. My personal reading involved a parallel between Aza and Russell Pickett that the novel draws later on. I believe that if you combine Russell's fascination with the Tuatara with the reading that the Tuatara is an ideal for Aza, you can say that Russell was suffering from a similar existential plight to Aza, and that his obsession with the Tuatara represents an unflinching desire to attain the idealized version of himself that he wishes to become in order to conquer that plight. His failure can be read as a message that existential problems and mental disorders are not things that can be solved, but rather things that people have to learn to live with. Is that a defensible reading? I really don't know, but that's not the point. The point is that my reading of the Tuatara is only predicated on the Tuatara's presence within the narrative. Sure, I talked about the Tuatara's symbolism in abstract, but I actually didn't reference any particular story beats or use of literary form to justify that reading. Not because I'm lazy, although I definitely am that, but because there really isn't anything in the story that the Tuatara contributes to beyond just being there. The problem that I have with the Tuatara is that a lot of its symbolic purpose in the story isn't actually fulfilled by it contributing proactively to the narrative. You could write the same story with the same beats while keeping the Tuatara for the whole time in a zoo in New Zealand. The symbolic contribution of the Tuatara is fulfilled simply by it being in the story at all, even only in mention, which isn't necessarily bad, but it keeps getting brought up and is even emblazoned as an emblem on the American hardcover edition. Any scenes featuring the Tuatara after its symbolic purpose is understood feel like distractions from what the characters are supposed to be doing otherwise. Once you understand its meaning, that static meaning applies to the Tuatara for the entire duration of the story, beginning to end. The stuff about parasites and molecular evolution rates are just random facts that remain true regardless of this story in particular, and the fact that Russell Pickett left his entire fortune to the Tuatara to the detriment of his sons happened well before the events of the story and had to be explained to us by Davis. Now, don't get me wrong, the Tuatara is actually a quite complex contribution to the subtext of the novel, however, it's a non-factor at best to the actual text. It's a well-deliberated and considered inclusion, but seemingly none of that consideration was given to how its inclusion affects the story. It's just mused about in abstract, and that's it. Green's most egregious flaw as a storyteller is that he forgoes the actual story as the mechanism to illustrate and discuss his ideas, which wouldn't usually be that big of a problem, except that often the delivery of those ideas is given priority over the delivery of the story. Now, this doesn't just affect individual symbols like the Tuatara and arguably, yes, also the Pettibon painting. There's actually more musings in this novel than there are story scenes. This confuses me because mental illness is a fantastic vessel for exploring self-authorship as a theme, and Green even showcases a way for it to be incorporated into the form of the text, albeit it wasn't entirely successful. I'm talking about, of course, the voice in italics.
I was pretty sure I had actually changed the Band-Aid right after waking up, just before I brushed my teeth, but the thought was insistent. I don't think you've changed it. I think this is last night's Band-Aid. Well, it's not last night's Band-Aid because I definitely changed it at lunch. Did you though? I think so. You think so? I'm pretty sure. And the wound is open. Which is true. It hadn't yet scabbed over, and you left the same Band-Aid on for, God, probably 37 hours by now, just letting it fester inside that warm, moist old Band-Aid. I glanced down at the Band-Aid. It looked new. You didn't. I think I did. Are you sure? No, but that's actually progress if I'm not checking it every 5 minutes. Yeah, progress towards an infection. I'll do it at the bank. It's probably already too late. That's ridiculous. Once the infection is in your bloodstream, stop. No, that makes no sense. It's not even red or swollen. You know it doesn't have to be. Please, just stop. I would change it at the bank. You know I'm right.
I can't speak as to how accurately this represents what it's like to suffer from OCD because I don't suffer from OCD. However, I will say that at least for the purposes of my experience of the story, the voice in italics was a solid way of helping me as the reader understand Aza's plight. Hearing Aza's invasive thoughts drew me into her mindset. It actually really does help with clearly illustrating Aza's struggle and helping the reader understand why she's suffering and how exhausting it is for her to deal with this as frequently as it affects her. It really brings the mental health themes into sharp focus and helps to ground the other times the theme gets explored because the reader is so aware of the real consequences that it has on the protagonist. If you've ever read a high-minded literary text that focuses on a very abstract or existential problem, you might find yourself feeling like the author is just waxing philosophical about some fucking pretentious nonsense. I mean, really, who cares about any of this? Being reduced to an insect as part of the dehumanizing process of the capitalist system that reduces the value of a human being to the work that they can accomplish? Ugh, I just don't get why this is important, man. Texts like these often, actually, most of the time they have something incredibly valuable to say, but as a reader, you kind of need to be on board with understanding the topic of interest prior to or after reading the story in order to really get what's being discussed and why it's even important. That might be well and good for avid readers who like to research stories and people who take literature courses in uni, but John Green is writing for a general audience who will be looking to be entertained, so drawing the audience into the psychological distress of Aza helps to get as many readers on board as possible, so that we all understand the tangible, non-abstract importance of the theme. As someone who doesn't suffer from OCD and doesn't know any sufferers, I personally found this very helpful. However, something that bugs me about the voice in italics is the framing of the conversation between it and Aza's normal narrator voice written in not italics. Not only are they two distinct metaphorical voices, but they're very obviously two delineated perspectives in conversation with one another. I definitely changed it at lunch. Did you, though? I think so. You think so? This is a dialogue, and the voice in italics addresses Aza in second person as though the voice were a separate entity. This actually doesn't contribute to the idea that Aza is losing her sense of self, which is a major part of the self-authorship theme. The reason is because we as readers can see such a clear distinction between Aza's authorial voice and the invasive thoughts, there's absolutely no confusion as to which voice would be representing Aza's true authentic self. The theme would be supported better using literary form if the voices weren't delineated like this. I'm not saying that it's necessarily a bad idea to italicize the invasive thoughts. Whether or not you want various elements of your text to be clear or opaque really depends on what you're trying to achieve, but the invasive thoughts almost end up reading as their own character because of the delineation, and I think this makes it inadvertently weaken the self-authorship theme in this weird, unintuitive way. You see, it's actually not the presence of a discrete second voice that undermines the theme, but it's the fact that Aza's authorial voice is also made discrete and distinct. You get what I'm saying, right? Aza tells us that she doesn't believe that there's something in her that she can definitively call herself, but we as the readers can clearly see that one of the voices speaking to us is Aza, and the other one is her invasive thoughts. So don't get me wrong, I love that Green is using the form of the text to contribute to both the narrative and the themes, but I feel like there must have been a better way to try and achieve the same thing. I can't make any suggestions for how to do this because, like I said, I don't have OCD, so I wouldn't know how to represent it truthfully. Now, despite me having trepidations with the voice in italics, it still shows that Green can come up with ideas for using literary form and story material to generate meaning in ways that simply telling the audience scenes wouldn't do sufficiently. My frustration with Green is that he has fantastic ideas, and he knows from what angles to explore them, but using either literary form or storytelling to get those ideas across is the exception in a Green novel rather than the rule. I suspect this contributes to the public's reactions to him being so extremely split. Several John Green fans whom I know will cite the core themes and ideas that Green raises as the reason why they enjoy his novels, whereas detractors will often cite the surface-level details of the story or the writing as their main frustrations. This isn't to say that the detractors are wrong because they didn't dig deep enough, just that if the things underneath the surface don't hook you as an individual reader for the bulk of the story, there's a low chance the actual story itself is enough to make you enjoy the experience. Themes are extremely important, but they're not the only part of a novel. Because John Green's narrators, the majority of his casts, and his target audience are teenagers, Green uses a relatively simple, straightforward vocabulary, incorporates flourishes into his narration through the speech patterns of the characters, and makes most of his intertextual references through the characters relating their experiences to modern art and entertainment, with a few classics thrown in there as well. This initially hits you on the surface level of the experience, and if you're someone who simply doesn't enjoy that style of writing, then you'll find yourself pushed away by his novels very rapidly. In that case, it's not because of a failing on the part of the novel, or the reader for that matter, it's just a mismatch between the reader and the text. To phrase in a much less pretentious way, maybe John Green just isn't your thing. Now, before you throw that phrase back at me, my problem is that I'm one of those artsy wankers who likes to engage novels on their own terms and at least try to accept the stylistic choices of the author. So while I could say that my dislike for Green's writing is simply due to my own biases and a difference in personal tastes, it would be far more profitable, far more constructive for me to try and outline exactly why I found Green's style unenjoyable. So whenever I pick up a John Green novel, I know that the implicit agreement between me and the text is that I will be willing to accept that it's a YA novel, it's realist, and it's written so that teenagers can understand it. So for this part, just assume that I was in the bookstore and was like, I want to read a realistic YA story about teenagers. That feels like something I would enjoy right now, and I picked up Turtles All the Way Down hoping for a good story of that nature. So basically, no complaining about the teenager narrator voice is what I'm saying. I wouldn't deliberately seek out a fantasy novel and then complain about a lack of realism, would I? Some things are just down to genre. So in order to criticize John Green's writing, I'm going to be doing a close reading of just a single excerpt of Turtles All the Way Down, and we're going ridiculously in depth. When I say we're going to be examining the writing, I really mean we're going to do this sentence by sentence. Because honestly, what's the point in telling a story in the format of a novel if you're not going to use the full potential of words as the conduit for creating an amazing experience in the minds of your readers? Otherwise, you might as well just go to a lesser storytelling format, like film or video games. So this is an early scene where Asa and Daisy are rowing towards the Pickett property to investigate the disappearance of Russell Pickett, the father of Davis, whom Asa and Daisy will meet shortly after this scene. My chosen excerpt starts when Asa and Daisy stop by an old island along the river as they row towards the back end of the Pickett estate, and while they take a short break, Asa gets nostalgic for an event from her childhood.
I steered the canoe onto the algae-soaked beach, and we got out to walk around. Something about the river had made Daisy and me quiet, almost unaware of each other, and we wandered in different directions. I'd spent part of my 11th birthday here. Mum had made a treasure map, and after cake at home, Daisy and Mum and I got into the canoe and paddled down to Pirates Island. We dug with spades at the base of a tree and found a little chest full of chocolate coins wrapped in gold foil. Davis had met us down there, with his little brother Noah. I remembered digging until my spade hit the plastic of the treasure chest, and allowing myself to feel like it was real treasure, even though I knew it wasn't. I was so good at being a kid, and so terrible at being whatever I was now. I walked along the whole edge of the island until I found Daisy sitting on an uprooted barkless tree that had beached here as some flood receded. I sat down next to her and looked into the little pool below our feet, where crawfish were darting around. The pool seemed to be shrinking. It had been a drier summer than usual, and hotter.
So let's take a look at the opening paragraph. Something about the river had made Daisy and me quiet implies that Aza and Daisy were already quiet by the time they reached the algae-soaked beach, even though the reader is told about it after they've already stepped onto it. This is also strongly suggested by the absence of dialogue or any mention of verbal communication between Aza and Daisy after they passed the first bend of the river earlier in the scene. Now, if something happened in the scene, I don't get why you wouldn't simply mention it as it happens. The problem with mentioning a detail like this after the moment when it happens in the scene is that it interrupts the action taking place. If you rearrange these sentences so that Aza and Daisy are first established as being quiet, you could write it out like this. Something about the river had made Daisy and me quiet. I steered the canoe onto the algae-soaked beach and we got out to walk around. We wandered in different directions as though we were unaware of each other. What I've done is basically arrange all of the elements into the order that they happen chronologically. Aza and Daisy were quietened by the river before they landed on the beach, so I mention it first and then describe them landing and getting out of the canoe. I also decided to put the bit about them being unaware of each other after they wander in different directions, because that's the action that would give that idea to a hypothetical onlooker. You know, if you saw two young girls being silent as they rowed a boat onto a beach, that by itself wouldn't make you think, those girls must be unaware of each other, but if you saw them wordlessly just walk off in different directions without any sort of exchange or acknowledgement, then you might go, oh huh, that's odd. So that's why I put that observation at the end. I think this arrangement of the paragraph has a lot more flow to it because the action is always moving forward. In John Green's version, the observation that Aza and Daisy had been quiet the whole time interrupts the flow of the action because the reader is told that they get out of the canoe to start walking around, but then we're told that they had been made quiet, and then we're told that they're walking around again. This doesn't flow because they don't become quiet while they are walking. The tense tells us that they had been quiet this whole time, so there's really no reason to interrupt the action like this. Now, I've deliberately included pretty much every element from Green's version in my rewrite, but there are a few other alterations that I would say help this paragraph. For one, I don't think that something about the river adds anything to the scene. This image doesn't give the reader anything specific, it's vague to the point of being meaningless. By this point in the chapter, the reader already knows that the pair have been rowing down a river in the late afternoon for some time, so the scene has been set. The reader can assume that if Aza and Daisy are quiet, it's because of the context or environment they're in, unless the text clarifies otherwise. So instead of something about the river made Daisy and me quiet, I would simply write Daisy and I quietened, or were quiet, or remained quiet, depending on what suits Green's intention. I personally like the short cadence of quietened the most, but unfortunately that implies that they were talking just before this paragraph, which doesn't appear to be the case. So to maintain the continuity of the scene, I'd go with remained quiet. Now, it's already been established in this scene that Aza is the one steering the canoe, so you could just say that the canoe landed on the beach and the reader would still know that Aza was the one landing it. Similarly, and I'm not as confident about this one, but here goes, because we would assume that they got out of the canoe if they're wandering around, you could feasibly take that step of the action out of the sentence and just have them land then wander around right away. So my final version of the paragraph would look like this. Daisy and I remained quiet. After the canoe landed on the algae-soaked beach, we wandered in different directions as though we were unaware of each other. I think this version is better because it contains all of the same core information and beats, but is more concise and flows better than the original. Now, in making it concise, I'm not actually aiming for the lowest possible word count. However, I do think that shortening bloated sentences much more often than not improves the writing style on the macro level. This is just my experience, but when I first read Turtles All the Way Down, I felt like I wasn't getting a good amount of actual substantive storytelling given given the volume of words I was reading. The novel feels not just slow, but sluggish, like it was dragging its heels rather than moving at a deliberate pace. Bloated writing isn't the sole reason for why this is. I have already shown that much of the bloat is due to the random musings, but it's nonetheless certainly a major contributor. I can enjoy long stories. I can even enjoy stories that are supposed to be slow or exhausting, but even then, the writing has to be dense. This is why I made an entire video on why I think Gabriel Garcia Marquez's writing style is so great. Marquez's writing is rich and packs in a lot of meaning into short passages, so even when reading through some of his longer and slower novels, I rarely ever get bored. Okay, so the next paragraph is longer and it mostly has the events it's describing in chronological order this time. So we're first given context. This is Aza remembering her 11th birthday. It starts with her mother having already made the treasure map, presumably in advance of Aza's birthday. Then they eat cake, presumably on her birthday, before going to the island. They reach the island and then dig until they find a treasure chest. Then some bad ordering happens. Davis and Noah met them either before or while they were digging, but their introduction into the scene comes after the sentence where Aza finds the chest. This means that the sentence after the boys are introduced has to mention her finding the treasure chest again. Funnily enough, because of the way Green chose to write this paragraph, you can fix this problem if you just swap two of the sentences around. Daisy and Mum and I got into the canoe and we paddled down to Pirates Island. Davis met us down there with his little brother Noah. We dug with spades at the base of a tree and found a little chest full of chocolate coins wrapped in gold foil. I remembered digging until my spade hit the plastic of the treasure chest. After Aza finds the treasure, she reaches the part of the memory that's critical for the reader. She allows herself to believe that the clearly fake treasure is real and ends the paragraph with what over the years I've come to jokingly call a thesis statement, which is where the narrator or one of the characters briefly summarizes an idea that can otherwise be inferred by just reading the story. I don't think that Green needs to include this final sentence. The memory has enough symbolic meaning on its own that you can make a substantive interpretation without it. I would just cut this final remark. Now, despite those two criticisms, this paragraph on the whole is actually quite solid. It evokes happy imagery such as birthdays, cake, adventure, getting together with friends, and playing silly little pretend games. It's very clearly illustrating that Aza is yearning for a past where she was happier. Green here shows us an example of when adding extra words contributes to the meaning of the sentence. I remembered digging until my spade hit the plastic could have been written as I dug until my spade hit the plastic, which is more concise, but the word remembered emphasizes the temporal distance between Aza and this event. It gives the impression that her years of childhood happiness and simplicity have already slipped away from her, so that's good. Likewise, the deliberate mention of plastic emphasizes the artificiality of the activity. It's a symbolic way of giving the impression that maybe Aza is looking upon her past not simply with fervor, but also with a level of disdain. Her happiness was derived from playing pretend games about finding fake treasure and having those activities orchestrated by her mother. So there's a strong sense that Aza's happiness itself was maybe a little artificial, or at least based on an artificial experience. This is important thematically for the story, as her mental illness is supposed to make her feel swamped by her misery. Her unhappiness stifles and suffocates her. Part of that is the illness attempting to delegitimize any happiness that she felt in the past by making her look back upon it with a subtle air of resentment that it was perhaps all a fabrication. Green could have easily just given Aza an unhappy childhood and used that to explain why she's miserable all the time, but generically unhappy childhoods are a dime a dozen in fiction these days, so I appreciate that he did something a little more complex. This is why I don't think you need this thesis statement at the end of the paragraph. It's not actually a good way of summarizing the relevance of the memory, and it also runs the risk of making the reader think that's what the point of the paragraph was. I actually didn't get the meaning of this paragraph on my first reading, partly because this sentence shot down my desire to interpret it for myself. It makes me wonder how many other times I and other readers have rolled their eyes at Green's writing and gone, I get it, even though we've completely missed the actual underlying meaning. So here's my attempt at rewriting this paragraph for myself. I'd spent part of my 11th birthday here. After cake at home, Mum produced a treasure map and we all canoed down to Pirates Island. Davis and his little brother Noah met us there and we dug at the base of a tree. I remembered digging until I uncovered a tiny plastic chest full of chocolate coins and letting myself believe it was real treasure. So this version relies on the reader inferring that the chest was left there by the mother, which might be just a bit too obtuse, but I think that the mother producing the treasure map is obvious enough of a clue to that end. I also mentioned the treasure map after the cake because even though it was prepared beforehand, you can just say that Asa herself was introduced to the map after she ate the cake. Now, something that I took out of the final paragraph was "my spade hit the plastic," because I couldn't find a way of including it that sounded good and didn't involve breaking the final sentence in two. Whether it's best to include this detail or keep the paragraph as concise as possible is actually something that you can make a case for either way. Personally, I tend towards dense and concise writing, but if you think that mentioning the spade hitting the plastic is essential to the passage, then it's perfectly reasonable to keep it. Oh, by the way, I found a genuine typo. That first comma is an actual error, and yes, it's in the book. I feel so validated. So we are given a few details about this tree. We're told it's uprooted, stripped of bark, and that it had been beached in a flood. I think that's a few too many words to generate this image. Put a pin in that for the moment. I think "as some flood receded" is a bit too vague for what it achieves. Well, I mean, yeah, it is speculative on Asa's part, so yeah. But if we take that out of the sentence, it frees up the detail about the tree being beached that we can just throw in front of the noun. That does create the problem of listing 3 adjectives before a noun, which for this passage is a little clunky. So the next change I would make is to somehow replace the words uprooted and barkless while retaining the imagery they generate. How about "I found Daisy sitting on the carcass of a beached tree." I like the word carcass here because I think it generates a similar image without having to list off the extra details. Some of you might be wondering whether mentioning that the tree was uprooted, barkless, and had been beached in a flood adds to the symbolism and that I might be hurting that by removing those details. I would argue that this doesn't actually matter because those characteristics can be reasonably inferred simply by telling the reader that the tree is beached. You know, because a tree isn't going to be beached and rooted into the ground. I sat down next to her and looked into the little pool below our feet where crawfish were darting around. It's fine, no complaints, maybe it's just a little boring. The pool seemed to be shrinking. Nothing really to say here. It's good, it's nice, it's concise. It had been a drier summer than usual and hotter would more naturally be written out as "it had been a hotter and drier summer than usual," or better yet, "the summer had been hotter and drier than usual." Green's version contorts the syntax of the sentence around ending on the word hotter, and the awkward phrasing ends up being what necessitates the extra comma. Not that you can't do that, I just always have to wonder why, and if you do have a reason, is there a more elegant way to achieve your purposes? So if it is crucial to the meaning of the sentence to end on the word hotter in order to draw attention to that, how about "the summer had been unusually drier and hotter"? You don't need to sacrifice elegance to generate meaning, you know. Now, some of you are probably rolling your eyes at me. Look at this nitpicky asshole going in sentence by sentence and being the world's most obnoxious pedant. Clearly this man is mad, which, thank you, I try. Yes, most of what I'm talking about here will never be noticed by readers, but it does affect their reading experience. Like I said before, the bloated word count might not matter for individual sentences and paragraphs, but it compounds over the course of the novel and makes it on the whole feel sluggish. Likewise, these other bad writing choices aren't just contained to this segment. The poor ordering of actions, inelegant phrasing, and thesis statements are strewn throughout the story. They don't necessarily ruin the reading experience in the micro, but if you keep finding, for example, that scenes of otherwise continuous action seem to stop and start all the time, or that it just feels like the story wants to tell you what it's about rather than requiring that you interpret it yourself, or that you keep tripping over sentences that just feel a bit clunky. That might affect not only your enjoyment, but also how you read the novel. I have a suspicion that a contributing factor to a lot of the criticisms against John Green as a storyteller result from certain readers seeing random musings and thesis statements and mistakenly assuming that's the only way that Green is juggling his core ideas, which is compounded by the clunky writing that discourages them from paying attention to symbolism, so they don't bother attempting to interpret the story's meaning from the actual subtext. You might call those readers lazy and say that they ought to take the time to understand Green's writing before criticizing or dismissing it, but I mean, would you use your limited time on this earth to closely study a book that you don't enjoy? Come on, that would be stupid. Think me a petty nitpicker all you want, but cleaning up the writing is what's supposed to happen in the editorial process. This is not to say that John Green or his editors were lazy. Believe me, I've written feature articles for a magazine that were only a measly 2,000 words each, and even then the process is bloody laborious. Professional editors want so many drafts, you have no idea. Writing and editing a commercial novel is a Herculean task, and the goal of the editorial process is not to make the final product perfect, as it were. One of my editing mentors gave me this wisdom. Every piece of writing can be improved with another draft, but eventually you just have to hand it off. Now, I don't know what Green and his editors did through the drafting process, but considering he's a big deal as far as contemporary authors go, and is both well-read and a talented author, I think they didn't do nearly good enough. I wouldn't say this is a case where one more draft would have ironed out these problems. I think Green and his editors may have some bad writing habits that they don't know about because no one in critical circles is mad enough to perform close readings for the purpose of consumer review. Except me, I guess.